Hello, listeners, and welcome to part 2 of the mini-series on the Nawaubian Nation led by Dwight York. In part 1, Jamiyla discussed how the group was founded, the cultural aspects at the time, and how her parents met one another and joined the community under York's leadership. In part 2, Jamiyla discusses her time spent within the community before finishing in part 3 on how historical moments have changed the worldwide perception and identity of the Muslim faith. For early access to full-length ad-free episodes, you can sign up at patreon.com/The Cult Vault for only £1 a month. Now here is Jamiyla.
One of the most fascinating things about your memoir, which is not something I've come across before, was how you came to know about your experiences within the community. And I wondered if you could just paint that picture for the listeners.
It's so interesting because I first want to just start with, if I had an alternate life, if I were a lot smarter than I am, I would be a neurologist. And that is because I'm so fascinated by the way the brain works, and when the brain decides to reveal things and keep the door closed. So that's my preface. We left the community. I was in there for 2 years. So from the age of 2 to 4. And when we left, it was almost like the community had never happened. I turned 5 within a matter of months. I went to public school. I was still dressing in full Islamic garb, but so, I knew that there had been this other life because I wasn't wearing Lee jeans like all the other kids. But we weren't in the place physically anymore. So in my mind, I could almost like erase it like a whiteboard, just kind of swipe it away from my existence. We were still speaking a little bit of Arabic. We were still making salat. So there was still that in my brain somewhere. But I wasn't speaking Arabic full time anymore, right? I'm in public school. We speak English. We were living with my grandmother. She couldn't care less about us being Muslims, or, like she thought we were a little crazy. So she was, always trying to push the envelope in the opposite direction. Let's celebrate Christmas. Here's an Easter egg. Things things like that. So by the time I want to say I got to middle school, I used to keep a journal. Apparently, I was always a journalist, but I used to keep a journal, and I would write my dreams down. And I had a very vivid dream track. Every single night, I would dream about the exact same thing. Every night, it was the exact same thing, and the dream was there was this little girl in this big house, kind of afraid. There were never any parents around, meaning her parents. And the one dream that would show its face all the time was she would be tumbling down these spiral stairs, and like these carpeted spiral stairs, and it felt like a basement because it was just kind of dark and dank. And I didn't know who this girl was, which is just the strangest thing. It was like I was watching a movie every night. But I will tell you, Casey, I would wake up every day exhausted. Like, what is happening here? But like I said, I would write them down. And then I was 14 years old and thoroughly over this little girl haunting my dreams every night. I wanted to dream other things. And so I asked my mom. I just randomly went into her room one day and I said, hey, I keep having this dream about this little girl in this place. And then I describe the setting, what I see, what the girl is wearing, what the girl looks like, because to me, she doesn't look like me. I'm 14 now. My face, like everything's changed, And the other thing is we don't have any real photos from that period of our lives because photos were forbidden to be taken inside. So I do have one photo of myself from when I was in there, but I had never seen that photo. So I didn't have a memory of who that little girl was, what she looked like. My mom then says, wow, how could you remember that? And that's when it clicked in my head. What do you mean remember? I was like, what, wait, this is just a dream. I just need to understand why I'm obsessed with this kid. And my mom then said, sit down, we need to talk. And then we had a talk about the community. And I was sitting there like, what are you talking about? And then everything started to come back. Every little bit of memory I had, it was almost like doors just started to open, and I just started to walk through them, and I could remember, I could remember names of people. I could remember what things smelled like. I remember what people's eyes looked like, their feet. I mean, just the most minute details. And my mom really did not understand how I had these memories still. And I didn't get it then either, but having questioned a lot of people about memory, having read a lot about memory, having read a lot about the way the brain works, and trauma. And I now understand that I had a very traumatic experience as a child. And I decided the way I was going to survive and thrive was to act like it never happened until I couldn't hide from it any longer. And so that was the impetus for the book. Was I said, oh, so we moved into a crazy house. Okay, why? And that became my drive. I needed to answer that question. I needed to know why, because my thought was, well, I always thought there was something weird about you too. Meaning my parents. Yeah. Like every kid thinks their parents are just the strangest animals on earth, I would imagine. And so, it's like, oh yeah, I knew there was something weird about you too. And then of course I'm thinking, but we weren't the only ones in there, right? How could this have been? How could this community have existed? What was he feeding you all? And then of course I start to learn, well, this was a cult. And then there are other organizations that have existed before and that came after that is the same kind of vibration. And I really wanted to examine how people fall into these systems and how do they get out? And then once they leave, who do they become? Who are they? How do they process, if they ever do, what they experienced? So I really needed to understand why my family did this. And then of course I learned that there's history, culturally speaking, that will make people do things out of desperation.
I just thought it was incredible. The opening to your memoir, it had me gripped from the start. I just needed to know the answers to all those questions as well. And the rest of the book didn't disappoint in offering the answers to those. And you've since done a number of interviews with your mum to deconstruct her experiences within the community, and a lot of work on your own journey. So what do you remember of your time in the community between the ages of 2 and 4? What was your mum's experience of the community? What do you know of your father's experience? And the whole setup for everybody that was involved in terms of who had what roles, York's place in all of this, and the whole thing, the whole community.
My experiences that I remember, I guess I have to start with the emotional aspect of it. A lot of feelings of isolation. I felt very alone, even though I was always surrounded by other little girls within my age group. We were broken up within the community by ages, the children. So when I moved in, I was with toddlers, and then I graduated up to the older kids. And it's like, I guess, school or whatever, you move through different cohorts. So I slept in one room with maybe about 40 to 50 little girls around my age on a blue gymnasium mat. I remember that gymnasium mat like yesterday. I remember the smell of it. I remember how sticky it would feel on my skin when I would try to sleep. I remember trying to position my body in a way to sleep because I'm sharing the space with 40, 50 other girls, right? So we're all just kind of like pretzeling ourselves into some comfort zone. We had four who I thought of as like aunties. So they were our caretakers. My parents were not my caretakers. The way this system was that the moms or women, they had women's work to do, whether that was cooking, cleaning, child rearing. The child rearing was not their own children. The men would peddle York's teachings. As I said earlier, they would go out into the streets, they would ride the train, they would sell his books, they would sell oils, they would bring back the money for the community. Children, well, we were just supposed to be kind of quiet and just do what we were told. So I remember very distinctly, I remember watching Tom and Jerry cartoons because that was a very happy time for me, was just kind of to sit down and watch these cartoons because we didn't have like a lot of just ridiculous child time. You know, there was no screaming through the hallways. There weren't tantrums to be had. We were like little baby soldiers. I have memories of making wudu, which is the cleansing that Muslims do before they make salat, which is prayer. I remember making this cleanse at either in the tub or at the sink with like two other girls. So we would again all be sharing the space, and there would be an standing over us, watching us to make sure that we did it correctly. They were teaching us how to do it correctly, but also it was like, do not be dirty kids going to make prayer because we will smack you. I remember the physicalness of it. I have memories of a ruler. I remember what the ruler looked like. It was like one of those wide rulers, right? Like the ruler that was double the size of your average size ruler. And that's what we used to be hit with. We were always hit with rulers and on our hands and our feet. They would never hit us on our bodies. Like hands and feet are part of the body, but, it wouldn't be on your face or your legs or nothing like that. And I think I could be guessing, but I think it was to make sure there weren't any bruises. I remember the prayer room. I remember that. I remember the playground. The playground was in the back of the children's house. So there was the children's house, there was the women's house, and then there was the male's house. And the women's house was literally connected to the children's house. They can move back and forth. And women who took care of the children stayed with those children. So these are with us all the time, 24/7, all the time. So those are my very, very distinct memories. Personally, my mom, I know that she moved through a lot of different jobs while she was there. But the main thing that she ended up doing was child caring also. She said that she really liked to take care of babies. So she had the infants. And as beautiful as that might sound, I don't think it was that beautiful because these were not her babies. These were other women in the community's children who they were not allowed to take care of. So these women would come in, they would breastfeed, and then they would leave. And it was my mom's job and another woman to take care of these babies in their cribs. I know my mom worked a lot. I know she said that she was tired a bit. And not a bit, but she was tired a lot. That was because she wasn't just taking care of one infant, there would be 8 infants. My mom was not she was a mom, she had one child. So she went from one to, like half a dozen. And that was not her specialty. So that was a lot of what her life was. And I gathered from interviewing her that she too felt isolated. My father was in his own space. The men had their own things going on. So I don't think they saw each other a lot. She and I did not see each other a lot. We had twice daily visitation times for 45 minutes each. This was across the board for all parents. You want to see your kid, you can see them twice a day for 45 minutes. So that's how we would see each other. But then she and I had a strained relationship because, well, I was angry. I'll just say that. I was kind of a little pissed off toddler. And we actually didn't even speak the same language. I had learned Arabic because, well, I was two and I was just a big old sponge. And English was forbidden to be spoken inside of the community. Arabic was the language that we spoke. My mom, being an adult, struggled to learn this really beautiful, complicated language. So her language skills, they were extremely subpar. So if the rule was you can't speak English, well, what happened? She didn't speak. And at least not to me. She did not speak to me because all of our visits were also overseen. So someone would tell on you if you stepped out of lines, and you didn't want that to happen because then your rations might be taken away because everything was rationed. You might not get food. You might not get sanitary napkins if you needed them. You might one day wake up and not have a place to sleep. And the place to sleep was effectively just a mattress on the floor. But maybe you might one day not have a mattress. You're just on the floor. So punishment was a real practice in there. People would also be expelled. Entire families would be expelled if they stepped out of line. And as an outsider, that might seem like a really great thing. Yes, escape this place. But if this is your home, right? If these are your people and you've walked away from your other people, it's awful to be expelled, because then what do, right? You've lost all of your outside connections. And the people who you've given up everything for, they no longer want you. So that was one thing that I think my father was maybe something that he paid close attention to, was never stepping out of boundaries or being caught stepping out of boundaries. And I think the same for my mom. She made sure to not get caught or to make friends with the right people, like York's wives, which is exactly what she did. And York, I didn't see him much. Or at least I don't have a lot of memories of seeing him. When we would go to make prayer, sometimes he would lead the prayer, and so I would see him then. But it was almost like he was this floating figure for me that would come and go. I don't think my mom saw him a lot either. He also did not live amongst the quote unquote people. He lived in his own house with his family, the good life, I mean, he was the prince. So, he lived in his own space and things would come to him. So he did not have to actually, leave the castle to go and get anything. Everything was brought to him. But my understanding from my mom is that he would make appearances if he felt morale in the community was getting too low. If maybe there was a rebellious flare sparking, with people because they were hungry or they weren't getting the kind of medical attention that they needed, whatever it was. But then he would make an appearance and, kind of like, I guess I'm the Wizard of Oz, and remind everybody why they were there.
Did you ever have a conversation with your parents around the treatment that you were subjected to whilst you were under the sort of the overwatch of the aunties? Was this something that they were aware of?
I absolutely did have that discussion, and there were multiple different responses. My father, he said he'd never heard of children being physically hit within the community. And he said if he had known, we would have left. My mom first said she'd never heard of that. And of course, I was like, you can't work with children and not hear about children being abused. Yeah. So I kept pushing. And then she says, oh, yeah, I remember hearing something about that. And it's like, yeah, okay, all right, we're getting closer to the truth here. And of course, I keep pushing because, it's what I do. And then she said, well, yes. And that is the reason why she felt an urgency to leave, was that she thought that the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, which is one of the organizations in this country that a lot of people are terrified of for good reason. She said that she felt the FBI was going to drop into the community and take everyone's children and lock all the adults up. You can't think that unless you think that there is something awful happening to these kids. So, yes, that is the trajectory of the answers, the different answers that I've gotten from my parents. So I think for my mom, I think personally it might have just been hard for her to accept that abuse had happened to me at such a young age while she was literally maybe on another floor, or in the building next door or wherever she was.
And how did your parents' relationship play out during their time at the community? Was it strengthened? Was it weakened? Or did it kind of just dissolve? Because it doesn't sound like there's much time for, intimate partnerships.
I would say that the community is probably the thing that broke my parents up. They did not see each other a lot. None of us saw each other a lot across those 2 years. And I think my mom really started to resent my father the more she started to learn about the community, the more isolated she felt, the less power she felt that she had, right? The whole point was for us to feel powerful in some way. And that was not what she was feeling. So I think she really blamed my father for taking us in there ultimately. And then some bad things happened to their marriage inside of there. Like my father had an affair. My mom found out about it in one of the worst ways. It was in a very cavalier kind of way that someone said to her, oh yeah, so your husband is, having this affair with this woman who, by the way, has been taking care of your child. Well, you can't. And I think that really ripped a hole in her. And I think she said, okay, enough of this, but it's not like they got divorced. Once we left, they still were married. And actually, when we left, my mom was pregnant. Uh, so something happened. They found a way to get together some way or another. Um, but yeah, just because my mom had my brother, um, she was effectively a single mom after that.
Aside from some of the traditional religious practices that might come with the Islamic faith around your attire, around your dietary restrictions, around Ramadan and other religious practices, what was specific to the community that people might look at and say, well, that could be seen as cult-like?
Well, the clothing, I will say, was traditionally conservative. Women wore veils, men wore jalabiyas. And the jalabiyah is when you see a man who's like wearing pants and then he looks like he's wearing a long dress, like a really long tunic, basically over that. They wore kufis, which is the headdress that men would wear. Little boys would wear them also. Girls wore headscarves. And we also wore really long dresses. So everything, we were very modestly dressed. Um, that I would not call cult like at all. That I would just call conservative, very much conservative Islam. Um, the cult like aspect, a lot of it was the control of people, just controlling people. One, breaking up the family, right? The fact that we did not have a nuclear unit, that is so not Islamic at all. Uh, yes, there are some um, practices within Islam where there's polygamy, and it's pretty big in Islam for men to have many wives, but that's not in all practices of Islam, and not all men want to do that. A lot of them, they like this woman and they like this, and that's it. It's not a mandate. It was a bit of a mandate within the community for men to take on multiple wives. The problem with that, Casey, is my understanding of Islam is that if a man has multiple wives, that means he also has the financial means to care for these multiple families. And he actually has to treat them all equally. They're all equal because they're all his family. Well, within the community, no one worked, right? There wasn't any income coming in individually. So how in the world could you have multiple wives, right? Like, how are you taking care of these kids, these women? So that's just, again, like I say, taking a page from a book. The food, when we talk about food, everything was rationed. That's a form of control. So breaking up the family so you can control the parents, control the children. Then you ration everything for them. So everything you have to rely upon York for everything, for your food, for, if they wanted to leave. Let me also say that our community was surrounded by gates. So if you wanted to leave the gates, like, you actually had to get permission. We also had IDs, photo IDs. Tell me that's not a cult, right? And the photo ID was so that if you did leave, you had to show your ID to be let back in. People did not go to the doctor, or they did. Let me rephrase that. People did not leave the community for your everyday need. You were not going to the supermarket to buy anything. You were not going to a job. You'd left that job, right? Like, your job is to now work within this place. My mom said that the only women who were allowed to leave were women who had jobs that required them to be in the world. So maybe they worked in the medical profession, right? They had to be out there. But other than that, the women were trapped inside. and then the men were forced out, right? Again, this form of control. Trying to think what else. Oh, and then there was the physical control, right? Controlling the children through physical abuse and emotional abuse. We had guards outside of our doors. There were also schedules for when people, couples, could have sex and be intimate. That was even, I mean, so it wasn't just the food that was rationed. It wasn't just, your clothing that was rationed. It was also when you got to have sex. That was rationed. So all of these really important human needs, right? Things that we need as humans that we feel that we should have the freedom to experiment with or express. All of these things were controlled. And that, to me, those are clear signs of what a cult is. Any kind, and of course, when there's a leader, you need a leader. You need someone to say, I'm the one with the answers. I'm the one who knows how you should live, what the best rite of passage is for you. And that is classic cult, because a religion, I would imagine, is about communing, right? It is about, people coming together and loving up on each other and lifting each other up and helping each other become as enlightened as they possibly can, whatever that is for the individual. This was to feed his Most High, a lot of it. And that's just a clear cult mentality or environment, I should say.
You said the line earlier, one Muslim is all Muslims, but in the case of Dwight York, it feels like all Muslims are for Dwight York. He's building himself an empire,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, people adored him, which is, again, I think, counter to what the religion teaches, right? We're supposed to love Allah. We're supposed to love the creator. York is a man, and for him to, um, I mean, he would call himself a prophet, but I don't know how one becomes a prophet, to be honest with you. I'm not a theologian, but I disbelieve that he was a real prophet. And even just calling himself a prophet puts him on the same wavelength as the prophet Muhammad, who is a huge figure within the Islamic faith, I mean, huge. So I don't know how many prophets there are in Islam. I don't know if it's like Christianity where there's just a lot of people who get to call themselves prophets, or who are prophets, well, were rather. But even that, I think, was a non-Islamic thing for him to teach his flock, is that he was a prophet, and that we were serving God by serving him.
The community itself, you mentioned earlier, it was patriarchal in its formation. The teachings of Dwight York were patriarchal in nature to serve his agenda primarily, I imagine. But there were some pressures that the men were subjected to as well. There were certain targets that men were expected to reach, daily quotas that had to be fulfilled. And I wondered if you could just talk us through that part of the community before we move on to looking at what your life looked like after your departure from that intentional community.
Yes, the men did have pressures. The men, from my understanding, there were two roles for them. One was to be a guard, right? They would guard the place. We call them the mujahid, which in today's terms, they're considered very scary people, but as I was growing up, I just saw them as the men who stood outside of our bedroom doors armed, and that's who they were. And so if they weren't doing that, they had to go out and peddle, as I said earlier, and they did have quotas to make. I have tried to confirm what that monetary quota was. I have heard $100 a day. I've heard $200 a day. I've heard 50. I don't know. Maybe it was at York's whim, whatever he thought the pot needed to be refilled with. I'm not sure. But if they did not meet these quotas, sometimes, okay, I don't know what if there were physical punishments, right? For the men, I do know that if they had trouble making quota, I don't know, maybe there was a series of going out to peddle and coming back short, they would be expelled. They would be kicked out. They would be kicked out. Their job was to go get the money. And if they couldn't do that, there wasn't a purpose for them. So those were the consequences of the men and the pressures that they were under, was to either be soldiers or to be worker bees. And I think the soldiers probably had an easier way. You know, it might have been because they also wielded a lot of power. The soldiers, they were maybe like seen as number twos to York. You know, York is the one who chose them. You know, he's the one who said that you get to be the soldier. You know, so these were his chosen ones, and then below them were the peddlers, the men who would go out and push his teachings, and then below that would be the women, the boys, the girls. So yeah, the men did have pressures also to feed the flock without getting any of the money themselves, because they honestly had to turn all of their profits over to York or to the soldiers.
What was the position that your father held within his time in the community?
I would consider him a peddler. So he was one of those people who went out into the world with the books and selling stuff. But he was related to one of the soldiers. He was a cousin. One of the soldiers was his cousin, and that's how actually he was introduced to the teachings. So my father, may be lucky for all of us, he had an in. He might have been a peddler, but his cousin was a soldier, which got him access to York. It got him access to an iota of power. And that power meant that he could never be kicked out.
So at the time where you leave at the age of 4, just before your 5th birthday, it's just you and your mum that leave the community and your father stays behind?
That is correct. Yeah, we leave and my father stays. I think he stayed for maybe a few more months after we left, but we did not reunite. I don't even, reunite is the wrong word, because we weren't united inside. We did not unite. We didn't come together.
When you move out, does he come to visit at all?
No, no. It is almost like he never was, you know? No, I do not see my father in my memory that young until maybe he's in prison. And my brother and I visit him in prison. My brother was very small. I could see his little chubby cheeks in my mind. So yeah, we were really young still, and we visited him then, but we have never really had a strong relationship with our father.
Is he still in prison today?
No, no. My father is, dare I say, an elder statesman at this point. But no, he lives in Pennsylvania, and he is no longer in prison. He is now an elder, being an elder, doing what old men do, fixing cars and breaking them. That's what he does.
You'll have to pick up a copy of The Community if you want to know more about Jamila's father's misgivings,
Mishaps.
mishaps. But yeah, you'll have to pick up a copy of The Community if you want to know more about that.
That is the end of part 2 of this mini-series on the Nuwaubian Nation led by Dwight York. To find Jamila's work and a copy of her book The Community, you can follow the links in the episode description. To get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker Casey, host of the Cult Vault Podcast.